Next up, we have Andrew Bradley, Sustainable Travel Lead, Net Zero Travel and Transport for NHS England, who's going to talk about partnership. Andrew.
Thank you for having me to speak today. And this has been a really interesting conference so far, and I hope you're all enjoying yourselves. I'm going to tell you a bit about what we're doing in the NHS. We are the biggest employer in the UK and, hold on to your hats, the 5th largest employer in the world. Staggering when you think about that. And in many parts of the UK, many towns and cities, we're also the biggest trip attractor as well. Not necessarily a trip that many people want to make, but I bet that most of you in this room, if not all of you, in fact, I'd be surprised if there is anybody in this room that hasn't had to make the trip occasionally, will need to make. So, what are we doing in the net zero travel and transport space? Bit of background, in 2020, the NHS became the first national healthcare system to publish a plan to reach net zero carbon emissions, delivering a net zero NHS. And the NHS committed to reach net zero carbon for the emissions it can control by 2040, but it also committed to reach net zero carbon for the emissions it could influence, what we call our NHS Carbon Footprint Plus, by 2045. And what's really important about this is that this is not a sort of optional thing that we have to do. This has been signed into legislation under the Health and Care Act of 2022. And you can see just from some of the things that were circled there that a lot of it is to do with transport. How much of it is to do with transport? That much is to do with transport in terms of the kilotons of carbon. And to give you some sense of scale, in terms of the NHS emissions, travel and transport accounts for about 15% of the total emissions. And we account as an NHS for about 4% of all of the traffic on the UK's roads, which doesn't sound a lot, but it is huge. So, what are we doing about it as a net zero travel and transport team within the NHS? So, this year we got 13 zero emission ambulances going on the road. We have 21 zero emission Pathfinder vehicles, and we got 13 battery electric truck trials ongoing. That's the sexy stuff. The not quite so sexy stuff, although I'm quite into my buses. We've got 50 trusts in our NHS modal shift network. I will come back to that in a minute. We've got 20,000 vehicles in our fleet data collection. And I'll just pause on that because it's really important. The NHS loves collecting data. We got data coming out of our ears about all sorts of stuff. But we don't, or we haven't, until relatively recently, had a lot of information about transport. Why? Because it's not necessarily seen as core to the business, where it hasn't been, and also because the NHS is very disparate. Those of you that are not familiar with the NHS might see it as a homogeneous block. It isn't. It's a series of masses and masses of small organisations. So the fact that we've managed to achieve this is really good news, because actually when you know what the picture is, you know how you can deal with it. And really proud to say that I'm personally involved in our first paediatric clean air network. That's working with the 5 specific children's hospitals across the country, and that's just getting off the ground now. So, the other thing that came as something of a shock to all of us in our team at the end of October was that we were finally able to publish our net zero travel and transport strategy. I won't dwell on this too much because you can have a look at it on the internet and find out all about what we're doing and what we're proposing. But briefly, I will just point out that it's summarising the key interventions and the roadmap, the what and when for what we're going to do. There's a technical annex, the why, and an implementation toolkit for NHS organisations. That's the how. And this roadmap just shows you a few things that we are going to be doing. And key things that I want to just pull out of this. 2026, all NHS organisations to have a sustainable travel strategy. They haven't hitherto, and let's be honest, most haven't got one. They don't have an action plan, they don't have a strategy for what they're doing with regard to sustainable travel. 2035, all vehicles owned or leased by the NHS will be zero emission, excluding ambulances. And by 2040, the fleet will be decarbonised and business travel will be zero emission. But note, 2033, we've got to be at 50% for staff commuting emissions reduction. And that is a challenge. Because where we're at the moment is that 70% of NHS staff commuting journeys are made in single occupancy vehicles. And if we're to achieve that 50% reduction, we've got to work pretty hard. And this is where the partnership piece comes in, because we cannot do it on our own. We don't have the money, we don't have the influence, and we don't have the control of the surrounds, the environment that will enable us to do that. So this is just to give you a little bit more data, because as I said, we love a bit of data. We fed into something called the NHS People Pulse, and we surveyed 35,000 NHS staff from across England, and this just backs up what I was saying about the percentage of single occupancy car use, and you can see the massive outlier there, which is London, where actually most people are not travelling to work by car, but we have got our work cut out. So what are we doing about it? What we did last year was form the NHS's first ever modal shift network, which has 50 participant organisations in it, working across 4 themes: active travel, car parking, data and tech, and public transport. Working on a whole range of interventions, those are some of them just there, over a 2-year period that takes us through to October 2024. Why are we doing this? Because, as I said, we've got 220 plus NHS trusts, and that's before you get on to the world of primary care and GP surgeries. So what we need to do is find out what works, bottle it, and then reproduce it in other parts of the NHS. And we've got some early results. In Hull, they've now done their Spring 22 surveys and their Spring 23 surveys, and they've managed to achieve a whacking great 13.5% reduction in staff commuting on their own in cars. And if you want to come and find me afterwards, I'll tell you a bit more about how they've done that. And in Birmingham, in the West Midlands, working very closely with the main operator there, bus operator National Express West Midlands, they introduced bus taster tickets for all new starters. They started with 1 week, but because it was successful, they changed it to 1 month, 4 weeks. And we know that if you can ingrain those behaviours from the get-go, people are more likely to continue with those good behaviours. Note that second bullet point there. It's provided commercially by the operator. Why? Because actually 55% of people who try it are transferring to buying their bus travel. So it's in their interests. We can't do this on our own. There's some of the people that I'm working with. I'd like to work more with some of you. I'm sure there's stuff that we can talk about, so please do get in touch. Thank you very much.